You are connected, and you are listening to Specifically for Seniors, the podcast for those in the Remember When generation. Today's podcast is available everywhere you listen to podcasts and with video at Specifically for Seniors YouTube channel. Now, here's your host, Dr. Larry Barsh.
Today, on Specifically for Seniors, we're going to do something just a bit different. We have three guests who are here to tell you three completely different stories about parts of their lives. You've met two of them on previous podcasts, but they didn't have the time to tell you the rest of their stories. The third is new to Specifically for Seniors, but it's the story of a part of American history that our generation cannot forget. So make yourself a cup of coffee, sit back, relax, and let these three men tell you about a part of each of their lives. And welcome to Specifically for Seniors. Those of you who are regular listeners to Specifically for Seniors will recall Alistair Henry from our May 2023 podcast. Alastair retired at 57, shed his possessions, and went to live with a First Nations band in the Northwest Territory, then left Canada's North to volunteer working with local NGOs, those are nonprofit organizations, in Bangladesh. He and his wife enjoyed budget backpacking for 4 months at a time in Central America and Southeast Asia in their 60s. In 2020, Alastair endured a double lung transplant. Alastair is back today to talk about the transplant and the work he is now doing as a Trillium Gift of Life advocate. Welcome back to Specifically for Seniors, Alastair.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning.
Do you want to tell us the background story of the transplant? What led up to it?
Yeah. It was Christmas 2019. I was 74 years of age, and I was having trouble breathing. I'd been a smoker all my life, pack a day, and I wasn't really too surprised. I was expecting at some point in life that the cigarettes would get me, the addiction. I tried many times, and I just resolved to, say, okay, well, this is going to be my demise, Anyway, it was about January 2019. Yeah, January 2019. I had trouble breathing. It was really bad. I felt like I was sucking through a straw. So I went to my doctor, saw a respirologist, and I was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, not lung cancer. But that's bad. That's got a high morbidity of 3 to 6 years. So I said, well, what have I got? Have I got 3 years or 6 years? And they said, well, unfortunately, your fibrosis is quite advanced. You're looking at about 18 months. They put me on oxygen immediately, so 5 liters a minute. And, so obviously that was and then I realized, we all have to die sometime. We're all going to die sometime. But that gave me a best before date of about June 2020, 18 months to do whatever I needed to do. And I was okay with that because I wasn't like 55. I was 74. So I accepted that. Went on the oxygen 24/7. So I was carting this little oxygen cart around wherever I went. Had a unit in the bedroom set up, generating oxygen, because I had to sleep with the cannula up my nose. And I had to go and lose a few. No, but before that, okay. And then I looked at everything and I thought, okay, what's on my bucket list that really is the only thing that is important? And it was to go back to England, to say goodbye to my sister, my nephews and nieces and friends one last time. And so I did that in August 2019. I went to England with my wife, 3 children, 3 of my grandchildren, and we had a big party. Some of my nephews and nieces came in from London, France, and there was about 25 of us at this restaurant. And it was a wonderful, joyous occasion. I was just celebrating my life, and I wasn't negative about it at all, because I just figured, I'd had a good life, and man, I did last. I was 74. Anyway, I came back to Canada and realized that my fibrosis was progressing, because I had to go from 5 liters of oxygen a minute to 7 to 8 to 10 to 12. So come around Christmas time, I was just coming to grips with everything, thinking, okay, this is the last Thanksgiving, my last Christmas, last birthdays, last time I'd see these friends, and the last of everything. And I was okay with that. I had a sort of Buddhist mentality, Larry, that let me accept what is unconditionally. I wasn't angry, regretful, or looking to blame. I just accepted it, and my wife did too. We just accepted that this was our time. Figured there's a lot of people going to die before me, but they don't know it yet. So I was fortunate in that I knew and I could prepare. And I could gauge it because of my increase in my oxygen intake. Anyway, it was about Christmas when my children said, Dad, how about a lung transplant? And I said, you got to be joking. At my age, a lung transplant? There's no way. And my doctor hadn't mentioned it. So I tackled him about it. I said, what about a lung transplant? Is that possible? And he said, well, usually after the age of 70, people got diabetes, high cholesterol, heart problems. But I got checked out and I was in perfect health, other than the fibrosis. I had to lose a little weight, so I had to go to physio for a couple of months to get my body mass index, down to a certain level. But anyway, I went on the wait list in June 2020, and after 3 false calls to zip up, because you've got to. I was fortunate that I live in London, Ontario, just 2 hours away from the Toronto General Hospital, which is the hospital in Canada, in Ontario, that does the lung transplants. If I'd have lived further away, I would have had to have gone and lived in Toronto, because you need to be within 2 hours for the operation. So anyway, I zipped up the highway going in there, but that was weird, because I'm thinking, I may not get off the operating table, right? I don't know, 5% don't. And I thought, well, at my age, there may be complications. But I was okay with that, because I figured I'm going to die anyway, because that's what my children said when they said about the lung transplants. And I said, oh, I don't know. It's, it's highly invasive and it's very dangerous. I might die on the operating table. And when they said, well, you're going to die anyway, Dad, that was the turning point. That's when I decided, I'm going to go for the lung transplant. Anyway, cut long story short, Larry, September 3rd, 2020, I went into the operating room, came out with these new lungs. So that's over 3 years ago now, and they've been wonderful.
What was your recovery like? Must have been tough.
No, it blows my mind. I went into ICU for 2 days, because you got all these tubes, all these drain tubes sticking out of your ribs, because they go into your body cavities to get rid of all the fluids and stuff, because the lungs are they're encased in a pleura, so they go in, and it's separate than the rest of your body. So the rest of your body is, because they they snap your sternum.
Sternum.
Yeah, they push that back. They take your lungs out, cut them all off, put the new lungs in, sew the bronchus up and everything, put it all back, stitch right across. So I was in ICU for 2 days, and then what they call step down, which is like a halfway house, just to help you continue your recovery. And then after 8 days, they discharged me. And they said, no, hospitals are for sick people. You're not sick. And I said, I'm not. I said, no. And you're healthier at home, because the hospital's full of bugs, all sorts of people here with viruses and bacteria. Oh, sooner you get home, the safer you'll be. Isn't that weird? Anyway.
You make it sound like a car repair.
Well, it was in a way, I just had one little wrinkle, and that was a problem. Every 3 months, I had to go in for a bronchoscopy for the first 3 months. Bronchoscopy is where they go right into your lungs, take out a couple of little snippets, tissue. I think they take 10 samples, just to ensure that the body isn't rejecting or there's no infection. And when they went in, there was a little bit of a problem. They nipped the pleura, which caused one lung to collapse. It's called pneumothorax. Anyway, I went back in and everything's fine. So that was 3 years ago, and I've been perfect health since. The other thing is, back in 2000, I'm a writer, as you know. I started writing a book in 2016, a historical fiction romance novel, largely based upon early memories of growing up in England, because the world has changed so much, and I wanted to use all of this strong characters, and there were World War II vets wandering around Bolton with PTSD. There were no mental health help back in those days. They all lived at the Salvation Army. They got turned out in the morning and said, come back for supper, but we don't want to see you for the rest of the day. So they wandered around Bolton, and they were scary because they had all these weird, some mumbled to themselves, some shouted, and some were angry. And as kids, we were really scared stiff of them. And even adults, we'd cross the road rather than, confront them. Anyway, I had all these images in my mind, and I wanted to write a book incorporating all of that, plus the home children. I became aware that Canada shipped 120,000 children under the age of 14 to Canada without their consent. They were orphans because Canada had a labour shortage. So these kids came to work as on the farms as labourers and as domestics because nobody cared. They didn't have any parents. So it was a whole scheme they put together between the British and Canadian governments and the orphanages and homes in Canada. And it was diabolical. But in the history classes in Canada, they didn't teach about that. They didn't teach about the residential school problem or the Chinese head tax. That's it. They try to rewrite history and say, oh yeah, the colonial, it was wonderful. Anyway, I wanted to make people aware because most people aren't aware. And these kids were, they were indentured to their employer, the farmer or the homeowner. You see all these great big homes in Canada. Well, who looked after the babies? Who cooked, cleaned? Who cleaned the woodwork? Who cleaned out the fireplace? It was little 8, 9-year-old girls, domestics from England. Terrible. And they weren't treated as human beings. It was terrible. Anyway, so I started to write this story, but I stopped writing because, well, what's the point? I hadn't finished writing. And I thought, I might as well just focus my attention now on the last 18 months of my life and forget about the book. Anyway, with the new gift of life, I began writing again. And I finished the book. And so now it's available. So I brought it into existence. And that's one of the wonderful things I did with my gift of life. And now I'm talking to you too about everything.
And that was one of the gifts. And your other gift is working as a Trillium Gift of Life advocate. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, as I said, Larry, I told you a little earlier, I was very lucky. Every 3 days, somebody on the wait list dies. There's just not enough organs being donated. And people, you have to register to be a donor in Ontario anyway. In other parts of the world, no, it's mandatory. You have to opt out. But in Ontario, you have to actually register. And it's sad. And I just feel that I was so fortunate that at my age, the lungs became available and I got them. So it's a way to give back. So I tell people my story because I say, had my donor not registered as a donor, I wouldn't be here. I mean, I'm breathing through his lungs. And this is what people don't realize. The lungs will never be mine. They're a different DNA. They've been inserted in me, and I'm taking medications to make sure my immune system doesn't reject them. But oh man, could you imagine how grateful I am? Every day, every breath, I'm breathing through these lungs. So what I do is I advocate, I tell people, and I encourage them to sign the organ and donor register. And I do things. I have this little gift of life PowerPoint presentation I give to community centres, whatever, wherever I can. And I'm part of the team with Toronto General Hospital to put this presentation to schools. This is for children in grade 12 because it's the young people that haven't registered. I mean, they don't think they're going to die, right? So, and there's a lot of superstition. They think, well, I don't want to tempt death, There's a lot of people say, oh, no, I'm not going to do that. And so, we miss out.
Alastair, thank you for sharing your story. It's inspiring. I hope people who listen to this will sign up for an organ donation registry here in the States as well. Thank you again for coming on specifically for seniors and telling us this part of your story.
Thank you, Larry. It was a pleasure.
On November 22nd, 1963, a 26-year-old junior duty officer was on duty at Bethesda Naval Hospital when the casket containing the body of Jack Fitzgerald Kennedy arrived from Dallas. You met that naval officer in this podcast on May 3rd, 2023. Sorrel Schwartz today is a professor emeritus of pharmacology at Georgetown University Medical Center and senior pharmacology advisor at the FDA. Sorrel is with us today as we near the 60th anniversary of JFK's assassination. Welcome back, Sorrel.
I'm glad to be here. Excuse me. I'm glad to be here, Larry.
Sorrel, take us back to that evening 60 years ago. What were you doing when you were advised that JFK had been assassinated?
What I was doing, I was at the naval station at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda. Just a little clarification, the National Naval Medical Center, which is now the Walter Reed Military Medical Center. The National Naval Medical Center was comprised of component commands, one of which, the major one, is the Bethesda Naval Hospital, another of which is the U.S. Naval Medical Research Institute. I was actually had just been commissioned and in the Navy for 3 months. And one of my collateral duties outside of being a laboratory investigator was to, as all officers have at one time or another, it's called the duty watch, where in the off hours you have the duty of making sure that the place doesn't fall apart, and this for the whole medical center. So during the day, I was in my lab. I was informed by a colleague about the assassination, uh, or the attempted assassination at that time, and then we were all together in my department director's office as we listened and finally heard that he had died. Later that day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was not assigned the duty watch for that day. Excuse me. But I was waiting for my wife to pick me up to take me home. And I got a message from the duty watch at the Naval Medical Research Institute that they needed someone to add on to as a duty officer for the day because they're bringing Kennedy's body there. So I ended up joining the other duty officer. One thing I learned in my 30 days of indoctrination was commissioned is that when you have the duty watch, you're put pretty much in charge of things. So you can imagine that with the president's body being brought there for autopsy, there would be a lot of brass there, and there was a lot of brass there, enough to start a scrapyard. But they had just their own responsibilities, and the other duty officer and I had the responsibility of just making sure that things flowed right. Interestingly, and this is a rather important point, is that we had very little specific information. We knew that the president's body was being brought to Bethesda for autopsy. An ambulance had been sent out to Andrews Air Force Base, not for the specific purpose of bringing his body back, but just for the purpose of anybody on board Air Force One who might have needed some type of emergency medical care. And so I kept on getting calls from the administrative officer. The administrative officer of the medical center is like the COO. The commanding officer is this CEO, and the administrative officer is like the COO. And he was asking me if I knew how the president's body was being brought to Bethesda, and I told him that we were assuming it's going to be brought by helicopter, because anytime the president comes in for physical exam or something like that, they come in by helicopter, and this wasn't for physical exam, obviously, but we thought it was going to be come by helicopter, so we had the heliport ready. But we couldn't get any information. The Secret Service person who was at Bethesda could give me no information because he had no information, and they didn't have all the fancy communications like they have now. So I turned on the office television set, and as I turned it, as the picture came up, literally, they were loading the casket onto that Navy ambulance, and so I now knew how the casket was coming, and I I phoned up to the administrative officer to tell him that the casket was coming by ambulance. He says, "How did you know? Who told you?" I said, "I saw it on television." So that that's somewhat of ironic. Um, uh, when when the ambulance arrived, which is it's about a half hour drive from Andrews Air Force Base. Uh, in the ambulance were Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy, um, and a couple of other people who were obviously Secret Service agents. Um, we had a very large crowd on the base. People had found out by radio, obviously, or television, that they were bringing the president's body to Bethesda, and so we had well over a couple of thousand people on the base. And the security wasn't like it is today. I mean, you could go on and off the base at will. Uh, Today that never happened, but they so we didn't have a large crowd control problem, mainly just to keep them out of people's way, but we didn't have any concerns about behavior or anything like that. Mrs. When Mrs. Kennedy got out of the ambulance, uh, walking toward the entrance to the hospital, and I was about 6, 8 feet from her, walking backwards, and the whole purpose of which was to make sure that nobody stood in front of her to take a picture. They just uh, want a lot of press bothering her. Well, in fact, um, there was very little press in fact, I saw just one person who identified it as a press photographer. Other than that, uh, it's not like it would be today with cable television. You'd probably have dozens of reporters and cameras around, but there was no press, literally no press there, and that's borne out by the fact that there's very little, if any, photographic evidence of what went on with Bethesda. Mrs. Kennedy was still wearing the magenta or strawberry colored suit. In her suit, where the president's head would have been in her lap, was stained with blood. Uh, and But her stockings were uh, almost stiff with dried blood on them. So she had obviously clearly was in this traumatic, in the middle of this traumatic um, uh, attack on her husband. She was. Uh, I mean, she was well controlled. I mean, she had a stoic smile on her face, but uh, there was, there was no outward signs of disturbance. She didn't have to see it to know it was there. Um, then what happened after this is sort of what has complicated some things. Uh, we had a guard truck. It's this, it was like a semi truck, and that. The other duty officer and I, and then the military honor guard, which is made up of members of the four services: uh, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and they were on the back of the truck. I was on the running board, and Department of Defense guard was driving, and the other duty officers inside. And we rushed to get the coffin to the morgue and unloaded before. Again, we didn't know really if how much press was there, and we did not want a lot of press coverage on just moving a coffin and so forth. It just was, it was just a matter of taste. Even today, there's a limitation in how much they allow of unloading service, seeing servicemen who have been killed in battle unloaded from transports.
Let me take you back just one step before we go any further. There was an interesting story you told about setting up the perimeter and something about a rope.
Oh well. Oh yes. Well, we had taken a rope, which is fairly dirty because I'd been on the back of the truck, and we used it just to rope off an area so that if people came around back there, that it just showed where they had to stand. So we roped off this perimeter. And you may be referring to what I called that. At the time, the uniform of the day that I had is called dress blues, which are black. Um, had the wearing of gray gloves, but the rope was so dirty, I just didn't. I took my gloves off. I would have ruined them. And then when the honor guard was unloading the casket, um, I stood at attention and saluted. And I just glanced up and saw my hand, which was absolutely covered black with dirt from having handled the rope. And for some reason, I had this thought that here I am on this awful day, and I'm saluting the president, and my hand is dirty. My hands, I should have clean hands saluting the president. That's the type of thing that runs through your mind at those times. But um, I think that's what
Yeah,
you're referring
I
to.
thought that was a very
Uh,
touching part of the story.
well, it's something I remember. In all of these things that no matter, this is 60 years ago, but uh, there are two images that still are really burned into my mind. One was Mrs. Kennedy in her blood-stained outfit, uh, and the other was my hand, which was so dirty. I mean, those are the images I carry from from uh, from that day. I can still see my hand and how dirty it was. Um, but before before that, uh, there was an issue before when we first got to the morgue. Um, we were there, and the ambulance was supposed to be behind us, but it wasn't. And uh, uh, two cars were behind us. One was the uh, President's Air Force military aide, General McHugh, and the other was the commandant of the Army commandant of the military district of Washington, General, I think is Well, um, if I recall his name. Uh, and we didn't know what happened, where the ambulance was, and uh, so we almost got into a little bit of trouble because General McHugh was somewhat uh, touchy that night. Um, uh, Asked us if we knew what the hell we were doing, and uh, we gave a response which is not the type of response that a junior officer gives a general officer. And so he was he was getting out. General Q was getting out, about to say, "Who do you think you're talking to?" But he didn't quite finish it because uh, General Well, I think that was his name, who outranked him by 1 star, uh, said, "Hey, General, let them do their job." And so we probably escaped getting put on report or some other type of disciplinary action because he was quite annoyed with us. And what had happened was uh, at at the at Andrews, uh, the Navy driver of the ambulance was replaced by a Secret Service driver. And so by the when we said that we were going to go to the morgue, uh, our truck took off, the two generals' cars took off, and the ambulance didn't take off because there was a crowd around it, and he didn't know the way to the morgue. So we came back and we did this. I did this all over again. During the time when we were trying to find out what happened, I had made a comment uh, that uh, I can't believe we've lost the body of the president. And the guard, everybody chuckled. Then we realized, okay, no time for gallows humor. But um, that turned out to be uh, uh, something more significant than just a comment, because um, what transpired in the subsequent years in 1981, a book published by David Lifton called "The Best Evidence," in which it's claimed that there were actually two caskets brought to Bethesda, uh, and one had been surreptitiously uh, had contained the body of the president, had surreptitiously been taken somewhere in order for, as he called them, surgeons to make adjustments in the president's head to coincide with a theory uh, where the attackers were, over the where the alleged more than one assassins were. Um, this even to today, you can do it. I see it on the internet. There's still this discussion going on. Uh, what bothers me is one of the reasons I'm sort of willing to do this interview is that 60 years ago, I probably, well, not probably, I'm sure I'm one of the few living survivors of the time there. Uh, Having been a witness to what went on, I knew that all of this business about a conspiracy is uh, to modify the president's body and so forth was just a lot of BS. Uh, I told you that the administrative officer repeatedly called me to ask me what's happening, where is the when is the body arriving, and so forth. If there was some other uh, something else going on where a body was being brought to a back gate, as was alleged, and all of these machinations, the administrative officer wouldn't have been calling me to find out what's happening. He would have known well what's happening since he was in charge of running everything. So, um, but uh, the farther we get away from that date, the um, farther we get away from the uh, also the truth about what happened on that date. And like I say, if you look at all the documentaries that have been made on the Kennedy assassination, there's nothing about what went on in Bethesda. But there's plenty of what went on in Bethesda by people who weren't there. The one accurate description of what went on when we had lost the body, when the ambulance didn't follow us to the morgue, was in William Manchester's book, The Death of a President, where he very accurately described what went on while we were trying to figure out where the ambulance was. And he had gotten that from interviewing the Army's, the first lieutenant, who was the Army officer in charge of the honor guard. That was his representation was accurate, but that was also used by some as a primary reference to show that there was a mix-up or there was an intended mixing up of ambulances and so forth. But like I say, I was there. I know exactly what was happening because I was part of it.
When did the reality of the whole day hit you?
That's a good question. It's funny that you're in the midst of all of this, and you're just not thinking about the fact the president of the United States was assassinated. What you're trying to do is to make sure that everything was running smoothly, and you're getting a first-hand lesson on the responsibilities of duty officers. Because I was brought on as a second thought, so to speak, I didn't have to do what the other duty officer had to do, was to stay there overnight. So after everything was all calm and all the people had left, I was able to go home. And I woke up the next morning, and it just all of a sudden I was thinking about being all a part of this, and my mind had convinced me that I had just had some sort of a nightmare. But on the other hand, there were too many little details that were quite were quite clear. So my wife is still sleeping, and I got out of bed and I went to the door of the apartment, and I opened up the door of the apartment, and there it was laying open, the Washington Post, and I looked down and saw his picture, and I remembered 1917 to 1963 under his name. Then, as I've said before, that I was correct. I had had a nightmare, but it wasn't the kind you wake up from. But that was an interesting question about when it struck me, because actually up until that time I had not processed that we had a new president, that our president had been murdered, that I had been involved in the process of helping Mrs. Kennedy, of getting the casket to the morgue, all of that stuff. It was that moment that I just had to realize, and it took me a while really to realize this. And I thought that, I had, strangely enough, exactly 1 month earlier, been at the National Academy of Sciences, where he gave the principal address for the 100th anniversary of the National Academy of Sciences. So I had seen him It's the only time I'd ever seen him. Uh, he made that when he gave that speech. Exactly, I'm pretty sure it was exactly 1 month earlier.
Sorrel, thank you for coming on. This is a part of history we don't hear about.
Yeah, it. I have to tell you, every time I have in preparing my thoughts for this interview, I went back on the internet on the web and looking at all of the conspiracy stuff that was that's there, and it just 60 years later, but it's just it doesn't anger me. It frightens me. And then I think of um, you know our current day talks about discussions about conspiracy, and I think that these things have a life to them. They just don't seem to die away.
Sorrel, thanks again.
And my pleasure, Larry. I love I love your podcast, uh, and I'm sure that that the audience of this podcast well remembers November 22nd, 1963.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
My third and final guest on today's podcast is Robert Norris. Robert's story is one that many of us who were draft age during the Vietnam War era will have faced in one way or another. Robert is a Pacific Northwest native, Vietnam War conscientious objector who served some time in a military prison, and expat resident of Japan since 1983. He's the author of The Good Lord Willing and The Creek Don't Rise, but let Robert tell you his story. We're talking to Robert from his home in Fukuoka, Japan. So, good evening, Robert. Welcome to Specifically for Seniors.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. Thank you for having me on the show, and it's good to see you too.
You grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Tell us about your childhood, family life.
Well, yeah, I was blessed to be born in a beautiful part of the country in the redwoods of the northern part of California, in Humboldt County. And I was born in 1951, and so that makes me 72 years old now. And basically, we grew up outside of the town of Arcata, which at that time had a population of about 4,000 or 5,000, and we lived on the edge of this redwood forest. So it was really an idyllic childhood, fishing in the local stream for 6, 8 inch trout and playing baseball and going for long hikes and just seeing a lot of animals. And it was a wonderful childhood. And maybe I was like one of those TV show children of the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver, Opie or one of those. But along came the 1960s, and there was trouble everywhere, it seemed like. But still, we were hidden away behind not the Iron Curtain, the Redwood Curtain, and sort of oblivious to the outside world. But even so, there were a lot of things, changing even within our part of the world. And my mother ended up divorcing my father. And so I ended up having to move to a different town and lived with her and my stepfather. She got married about a year later. And my father also remarried. And so I ended up from the original family, I had one brother and one sister. But after my parents got remarried, we had a whole bunch of new stepbrothers and sisters, and all told, we had enough to make a baseball team. We had 9 brothers and sisters, and I would spend the summers with my father and the school year at my mother's place. And well, like any other kid of that time, I was obsessed with baseball and basketball and played a lot of sports and didn't really have too many problems. And except watching the TV every night. We were, very much aware of the Vietnam War. And so by the time I turned 18, of course, I thought the war wasn't my cup of tea, so to speak. But uh, how do you get out of having to go fight in a war in a country that you probably never heard of before? So at that time, and perhaps I was a bit naive, but the Air Force or the Navy seemed like a good alternative, and the odds of having to go directly to the front line of Vietnam would be heavily reduced. And when I talked to the Air Force recruiter, he promised me the world. I could play basketball all day long and have adventures in different countries around the world, and life would be great. And I bought it hook, line, and sinker. And so maybe on the first or second day of basic training, I knew I had made a big mistake. And fate intervened. And at the end of basic training, my job assignment was to be a guard for B-52 bombers. And so uh, when I was sent to my first base after receiving a bunch of training in how to use different weapons and so on and so forth, I ended up having to walk around B-52 bombers. And I was sent to a base in California near Sacramento. It was called Beale Air Base. And at that time, there was a lot of underground newspapers that were very critical of the war and talking about all the events that were happening there. The campuses erupting with demonstrations, and particularly the My Lai massacre news came. It wasn't hidden from us at all, and I ended up getting involved with a couple of guys who were working on an underground GI newspaper, and these short-haired hippies who only had a few months left before they were out of the service had been talking to a lot of the soldiers who had returned from Vietnam and reported their experiences and their thoughts and feelings and opinions. And I was also heavily influenced by the music at the time, music by Bob Dylan and some of his lyrics, and Crosby, Stills and Nash and others who were protesting the war. And Kent State was probably the final straw for me. Anyway, shortly after Kent State, I was given my order to go to Vietnam. And I took a month off. We were given 30 days of leave before having to report to a base in Texas for further war training. And in the end, I decided I just can't go. So I had probably one of three choices: go to Canada and probably never be able to come back to the States again, or refuse my order and probably face 5 years or so in prison, and then or just go underground might be another alternative. And so I ended up going back to the base, and I was called into my commanding officer's office and given a final order to go, and I refused the order. And so I was set to be court-martialed about a month later. And I was 19 years old at this time. And at my court-martial, which took about a whole day of deliberation, it all boiled down to how I had responded to that order. And I was facing the military crime of willful disobedience to a direct lawful order, which carried a punishment of 5 years in prison and not undesirable, dishonorable discharge. And I was found not guilty of the original charge, but guilty of a lesser charge, which they called negligent disobedience to a direct lawful order. And the difference being, I never used the word no when I responded to my commanding officer's order. I kept repeating the same sentence: I don't feel I'm mentally or physically capable of killing another human being. And during a whole day's deliberation, that was the difference, and I was sentenced to 6 months. And so I served my time and got booted out of the service with an undesirable discharge and returned to society. And fast forward a couple of years, I'd tried college a couple of times and tried playing basketball again, but I'd had too many strange experiences and just felt kind of alienated, actually. And so I ended up doing what a lot of young hippies of the time did, on a search for identity, I guess you could say. I hitchhiked across the States and then bummed around Europe for a few months and came into contact with a lot of other young hippie types who were backpacking around, and mostly Europeans. And I was amazed at the number of artists and musicians and painters that I came across. And I was so envious of their ability to speak 3 or 4 languages. And I could barely speak my own native language. And they all seemed to have fulfilled lives and exciting lives. And so when my money ran out and I came back to the States and hitchhiked back to the West Coast again, I now had a kind of target. I wanted to become a writer. And so that's when I first started writing, and started out with kind of short dashes, short stories, and over 4 years or so of working different labor jobs and working mainly as a cook, uh, and saving my money. I ended up 4 years later returning to Europe and to Paris, and was all set to try and write a novel based on all my experiences.
So,
And so
so
that
did
was
you?
really the start.
So did you consider yourself a hippie and embrace counterculture, the whole scene?
Yeah, I could say like Bill Clinton, except I inhaled. But yeah, my hair was pretty long. I had a beard, and I experimented with a lot of the things that everybody else was experimenting with. And but yeah, speaking of hippie, when I returned to Europe, I was in Paris, kind of heavily under the influence of Hemingway and the expatriate writers from the 1930s, and Jack Kerouac, Henry Miller, expatriate writers. And one day, coming back from walking on the streets of Paris and just observing life, basically, I came back to my rundown cheap hotel, and there were 2 men at the front desk trying to convey a message to the desk clerk, and one was an Iranian and another was an Afghan. And they were trying to give a message to the desk clerk, who spoke only French. And so I'd picked up a little bit of French by then, and I was able to give a crude translation, and the desk clerk seemed to understand. So these 2 men were just overjoyed, and they invited me out for a cup of tea. And so we became friends real quickly, and they invited me back to their countries. And so I was ready. I'd never been to Iran or Afghanistan before. So I said, okay, it sounds like a good adventure. And we actually, well, the Afghan traveled back by train, but I ended up going with the Iranian, who bought a car in Germany, and he could sell it back in Iran, and cover the cost of the journey. He and the Afghan were basically selling carpets and other ornaments and jewelry and artistic things for inflated prices in Europe, and they were making a pretty good living at the time. Anyway, the Iranian and I traveled the old hippie trail through. Well, we started in Germany, and we went through Switzerland and the northern part of Italy, then through Bulgaria into Turkey, and had quite a few adventures in the high mountains of Turkey, where it was still at the end of wintertime, and it was pretty severe weather conditions, and the roads weren't 4-lane highways, that's for sure. Uh, we escaped narrowly a couple of times, but we managed to make it into Iran. I spent maybe a couple months there, and then another month in Afghanistan, and ended up in India. The whole trip took probably about 10 months or so. But when I finally ran out of money, and I was able to use the last of my money to get a cheap flight out of India, and landed back in Los Angeles with 25 cents left to my name, and a severe case of reverse culture shock. But those were my main hippie experiences. Yeah.
And how did you end up in Japan?
Well, yeah, I didn't plan it. That's definitely for sure. But those earlier experiences in Europe, and then meeting so many really kind people on the road, on my around the world journey, and uh, I just had this dream that I wanted to live and work and study in a foreign country. And originally I thought, well, maybe Spain or Greece, someplace in Europe would be great. But I had a friend, a writer, who was living in Hawaii and on the island of Maui. And after I returned from India, I spent the next 4 years basically working on the oil rigs as a cook, and ended up in a oil refinery. Well, not it was a construction site that was building an oil refinery in the high desert of Wyoming, a very isolated place. There were about 1,000 uh, laborers who were building this oil refinery, and so I ended up getting a job there for about a year. Became the head baker, and there was nothing to do but work, and so we saved up a few $1,000s. And I'd been writing to this friend of mine, and he had an extra room, and he said, well, come on out, you can come here and work on a novel or whatever you want to do. And so when I got there, we started talking about his books and whatnot, and he had had more success in Japan than in America. He did okay with sales in the States with his books, but they were translated into Japanese, and he became very popular in Japan. And so he had been to Japan a couple of times and just had really good experiences. And he knew a couple of people who were working as English conversation teachers. And so he gave me the address of a friend. And so I contacted that friend, and he said he could put me up until I got set up. And so I ended up going to Japan on a one-way ticket and maybe about $300 in my pocket. But I found a job at a conversation school initially. And so it took a few years, but piece by piece, I was able to work my way up.
You didn't know Japanese. You
Oh,
couldn't
no.
speak Japanese.
Yeah. The only thing I knew about Japan at that time was that the United States had fought Japan in World War II. And I remembered reading those G.I. Joe type of comic books, from the 1950s that had all these caricatures of the Japanese with the soldiers with the thick glasses and the razor heads. And that was basically my image of Japan. And once I arrived in Japan, I was completely fascinated by just the kanji lettering everywhere. There's at that time not so much English, all the billboards, everything, and I landed in Osaka, so there was a lot of people there. Being a country boy, it was quite overwhelming to the senses of just people, sounds, noise, smells, everything. But it was fascinating, just fascinating, and I still enjoy it.
You got your degree from college in Japan
Yeah,
and went on to become a professor and a professor emeritus.
yeah, that was quite a long story too. I could never have dreamed that that type of life would eventually become part of my life. When I landed in Japan, I had very little money, and I was basically working illegally, you could say, on a tourist visa. But I was working there, and I ran into an American who had worked at the same conversation school and had quit the school and started his own school. This was the early 1980s, 1983, and Japan's economy was really starting to boom around then, and there was a great demand for English, and uh, even companies were doing a lot of research and development and opening up factories overseas, and they needed engineers who could speak English and communicate well in English with their factory workers. And so even companies were setting up English courses. And I worked for a few companies. I worked for a couple of conversation skills, and was basically in every type of teaching situation that you can imagine, from one-on-one lessons to teaching 5-year-old kids in groups of 20 to 30, and even conducting seminars with 100 people or so. And so uh, I ended up meeting my wife, a Japanese woman, and committed myself to becoming a permanent expatriate. And I got a sponsor for my visa. And conversation teaching is not a real stable type of job. And so I thought, well, if I could get a degree, a master's degree, perhaps I can catch on with a university or a junior college. And so I found an American correspondence course. And this is way before the internet, so it was a true correspondence course, with the old letters with the stamps on them. And it took 7 years to complete the course in education with a specialty in the teaching of English as a foreign language. And when I got my bachelor's degree, I was able to find a job at a vocational school that specialized in English education, and the graduates would go on to work in hotels and travel agencies and putting their English skills to practical use. But the salary wasn't really so good, and benefits were basically non-existent. But once I got the master's degree, which ended up taking about 7 years from the time I started working full time and studying at night, in addition to Japanese studies, uh, I worked a bunch of different part-time jobs. And one of the part-time jobs I found was at a women's junior college, teaching once a week. And just fate just once again intervened in my favor. And just as I was getting the master's degree, uh, an opening came up for a full-time foreign instructor. I applied and had to compete with about 50 other people, but fortunately, the final step was an interview in Japanese, and I was able to pass that, where my competitors kind of panicked, I guess, and their Japanese wasn't so fluent. And I was hired. And so because I could speak some Japanese, or enough to do my job, I could participate in meetings and be a member of committees and do things like go out to high schools to recruit students and things like that. So my first full-time job started when I was 41 years old, and started paying into a pension fund, and boom, 25 years go by pretty fast, and I was suddenly 65 and time to retire. And here we are 7 years later.
So you're retired now from teaching?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you ever look back and regret your original decision not to fight in the Vietnam War?
No, that was the best decision I ever made in my life, I think. And uh, there were a lot of people who disagreed with me, of course, and you know, you just have to deal with the criticism. And I was lucky enough, I suppose, yeah, to kind of segue into talking about my book and my relationship with my mother. I think I inherited a lot of her stubbornness. You know, and she was a very strong, independent woman who was always supportive, always went out of the way, and I caused a lot of grief for a lot of people, but she was always right there, holding me up and supporting me. So yeah, I've never thought twice about it. I've always been one who, whenever you come through to a fork in the road somewhere, it's like Yogi Berra said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. And don't look back.
Um, so the book is a tribute to your mother and your
Yep.
relationship with her.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. She
Let's
died.
let's repeat the title for everybody: "The
Yeah.
Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise." Pentimento Memories of Mom and Me.
Yeah. It's a fairly long title. And to explain the title a little bit, the first part, "The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise," my mother used to say that all the time, and she picked it up from her grandmother. And whenever she was facing some tough situation or her kids were in dire straits of some sort, she would always tell us, don't worry, it'll all turn out okay. And then the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise, then we'd all have a nice little giggle after that. And so she was a very optimistic person. And I thought, well, that phrase, kind of describes her attitude towards life as well as anything. Just keep your head up and good things will happen as long as the good Lord is willing and the creek don't rise. Then the Pentamental Memories of Mom and Me. I always liked the writer Lillian Hellman, who was Dashiell Hammett's lover. I don't think they ever got married, but they had a relationship for maybe 30 years or so, and during the 30s, 40s, and 1950s, and she was part of the Hollywood group that was blacklisted and had to face the House Un-American Activities Committee. And she was just a very strong, independent woman herself, and very liberal. And in the 1960s, she wrote 3 memoirs, and the title of one was Pentimento. And she used that phrase, which is a phrase used or a term used in art to describe when a painter paints a certain scene, a kind of rough draft of something, and then changes his or her mind, repents, so to speak, and then paints over that, and a completely new scene develops. And Lillian Hellman used this term as a kind of metaphor for memory. So as we age and we think back on our earlier experiences, those scenes from our earlier life change from time to time. And so after my mom died a couple of years ago, just short of her 95th birthday, I had all this correspondence from years and years of letters and emails. And actually, I recorded some of her stories about family. Growing up in the 1930s, they lived a life similar to the Joads in the Grapes of Wrath, only for her family, instead of Oklahoma to Southern California, they started in North Dakota and ended up settling in Washington and Oregon on the Columbia River. And so all those earlier memories came flooding back to me when I was going through all the earlier letters and even the recorded audio tapes that we had, a few videos as well. And it seems like my memories of her changed several times. And so I thought, pentimento would be a wonderful expression to use there too. Yeah, so
Now,
it's a tribute to her, and the way she was such a positive influence on my life, to her grit, her determination. She, in a time when it was very difficult for a woman to be financially independent, uh, she was able to forge ahead even after her divorce. She was always working, even cleaning rooms, doing people's laundry, doing whatever it took to raise her kids until she got married a second time. She was Catholic, and so when she married a second time, she was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and that had a strong, emotional effect on her. But she overcame that, and then at some point, her second husband did a lot of gambling and got into debt with thousands of dollars, and so she divorced a second time, and she paid back all those gambling debts herself. And in her 50s, she took night classes to become qualified as a legal secretary, and she ended up becoming a legal secretary and worked until she was maybe 58 years old and retired with a nice little pension for herself. She even, in her 40s, got a private pilot's license, and for 2 years worked as a fire spotter for the Forestry Service in the Lake Tahoe area. And so she was very adventurous. She came to Japan about 8 different times. We ended up taking a trip to Ireland one time to sort of search for her family roots. She was a Murphy. Her father's ancestors were from Ireland, and we ended up meeting maybe about 6 or 7 distant cousins, and just had a wonderful, magical time in Ireland. And so when I think back on her and the life she led and the influence she had on me, and I just feel really blessed that this was not only my mother, but my best friend.
She sounds like quite a woman.
Yeah.
I was reading over some of the reviews of your book. One stuck with me. Tom Nichols, journalist and author, said about your book, and I quote, Norris's story should be must reading for today's students who think that the 60s was all about Woodstock and high times. What do you think about that remark and your story and today's kids?
Well, I'm flattered that he would think that my little book would be must reading, for historical purposes. Certainly, a lot of time has elapsed since the Vietnam War, and we've experienced that. And I've often wondered, how is the Vietnam War being taught in American schools, particularly junior high school and high schools. And uh, if you go online to search for this kind of information, there are a lot of books. A lot of people have been writing memoirs, that cover the whole gamut, from soldiers who, fought in Vietnam to those who came back with PTSD, and the born on the 4th of July type of fellows who became very strongly anti-war, and all part of the baby boomer generation. And most of us are now in our 70s or 80s, and so there's quite a distance from the Vietnam War, and we've had so many wars in between. And every time it just it saddens me deeply that mankind never seems to learn. Look at what's happening today. I mean, what a horrible time to be young. I do gain some hope uh, in the form of I've read where a lot of Russian young men and even a few Ukrainians and Israelis have refused to fight and have become conscientious objectors themselves. And I just wonder, my God, the penalties they face are unimaginable compared to those that my generation faced. And conscientious objectors in the First World War were severely disciplined, and a lot of them died in prison. And then in the Second World War, the situation was slightly better. A lot of them performed alternative service in the CCC camps and whatnot. And by the time the Vietnam War came around, and especially my particular generation, the Supreme Court had ruled that not only could conscientious objectors be qualified in the religious sense, but also if they were sincere in their philosophical and moral beliefs and behavior, then a certain number were recognized. So the situation, seemingly had improved in America. But in other countries, they probably just take them in the back, yard and shoot them. And so I can't imagine the courage that it takes for young people from some of these other countries to do the same thing. As far as young people studying about history, I don't have any direct experience that, is that their image really of, was it just all smoking pot and listening to rock and roll music and going to places like Woodstock? And much of the hippie generation imagery in the mass media, the movies and whatnot, is kind of a caricature, it seems like to me. But I haven't really had any direct experience, so I can't really say. My only uh, direct experiences with my own students here in Japan. And for several years, I was responsible for teaching a class called American Culture and Society, which I had to teach in Japanese, but I often covered the 1960s and 1970s, and I used a lot of the anti-war songs that came out of those times, and this was during the Iraq War too, and so there was a certain number of songs that came out with pretty strong lyrics protesting the war during 2004, 2005 in Iraq. And my Japanese kids and some international students from China and Taiwan and the Philippines, Korea, they responded really favorably, and we had some really good, serious discussions. And so, if I can extrapolate from their experience to how young people in America are responding to the current situation, you can see the thousands and thousands of people that are out there in the streets, demonstrating now. And so, I have a lot of hope for the young people. That's the nature of young people, is to protest, dissent, rebel against what the older nation. It comes back down to, it's the old men who make the wars, but it's the young men and women who have to go fight the wars, and that's just not fair.
Yeah,
I think everybody feels that.
I have 4 grandchildren who are all about late teens, early 20s that I worry about.
Yeah.
My experience.
I was going to ask you, is there any discussion in the States these days about bringing back the draft?
I haven't heard any
about that.
Yeah. I haven't heard.
That's what I worry about, because I've read a few articles where during the last few years, the all volunteer armed services, they're not meeting their recruiting targets, and so, I mean, it wouldn't take much for Congress to reinstate the draft, and that's what I worry about.
My experience was I was in what was called pre-Vietnam era, 62, 63. I was given the choice of volunteering as a dentist. I'm a retired dentist, or waiting until I set up my office and being drafted. So
you chose dentistry.
I chose, I think I better volunteer. It might end up being a shorter period of time. And then we ended up, my wife and I, going to Vietnam about a dozen years ago. And going through the Cu Chi tunnels and as tourists.
Wow.
Vietnam still calls it the American War.
Yeah.
So, did we miss anything? This was fascinating.
I can't really think of much. We could always have another conversation anytime. Maybe on lighter subjects.
Anything would be lighter, but your life story is just fascinating as hell.
Yeah, I've been a lucky man.
So thank you. Huh? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've been such a lucky man, and I think a lot of that started from that first journey I took across the States into Europe. I just kind of gave up my fate to the winds, and whatever came, I was ready to accept it. And once I changed that attitude, nothing but good has come to me over the years. And so fear of the unknown is a normal thing, but I think I threw that out the window, and I've been very, very lucky.
What you did takes a lot of courage.
Well, thank you.
Just letting fate determine what was going to happen next. Yeah. I can't imagine a life like that.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Sorry. Read the book. But thank you for having me on, Larry. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
3 men, 3 stories. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors.
If you found this podcast interesting, fun, or helpful, tell your friends and family, and click on the follow or subscribe button. we'll let you know when new episodes are available. You've been listening to Specifically for Seniors. We'll talk more next time. Stay connected.